I mentioned last time that I've been doing research into Second Life in terms of basically how people lay themselves out in the landscape and also how they basically build the digital landscape in Second Life. If you're interested, let me know, and I'll post a link to one or two of the actual videos where I've done transects through different parts of Second Life. But easier if you actually just do it yourself. But I've got videos if someone's interested. I just post them in Panopto and put them into Canvas, but I haven't bothered so far. When we're looking at virtual worlds, and again, we're just using Second Life because that's the most durable. It's the one that's still around. Like I said before, Facebook has sunk estimated 150, 200, $300 million into their idea of the virtual world, which is tied to their huge amount of money spent on VR headsets, which doesn't seem to be going much of anywhere. And that's just the latest of a whole series of sort of failures. There's a bunch of sort of technical reasons why, not the least of which is folks that do all these designs are generally almost invariably from the United States, Silicon Valley area, and have a very similar sort of mindset about how you use computer platforms, software, and sort of digital stuff. And I think that tends to lead them very much down the garden path to the wrong idea, because the users aren't the same people as the developers. This clever thing about Second Life, which I think is one reason why it's been so successful, when I think about it, Minecraft is somewhat similar, is that you basically can make sort of a sandbox and then let people actually make the stuff themselves. And they actually, many of them get more enjoyment from doing that. Of course, in Second Life, the clever thing is you have a marketplace so that people that make stuff can actually make real world money off of selling the things they made. And folks like me that have no interest in making stuff can just buy the stuff that other people made. So you've actually got a full-on functioning economic system based on, sort of classic, object and transmission of object, even though everything's digital, it doesn't exist in the real world. So that's, what's something that invariably all the other developments, including Facebook's, have entirely sort of missed, ignored, or not paid attention to, which is sort of odd when something's been around for going on 20 years. Anyways, one of the key things when and leads to folks like me studying in Second Life is that you have to remember that in Second Life, people's references, whether it be for objects, whether it be for symbols or whatever, are going to be based in their cultural background. We will always interpret the present based in our past. And so when you're looking at Second Life, on one hand, yeah, it's digital, yeah, it's on a computer screen, it's a software platform. But the one reason why that you find things like, shopping malls and kitchens and houses in Second Life is because that's what people have in the real world. And if they're going to exist, at least temporarily, or play in another world, they want it to have the very same things or a lot of the same reference points that they do in the world to actually exist in. This is unique to Second Life. You see this, if you look at fantasy, if you look at science, sci-fi, for example, you'll see the same thing of sort of to make things believable, you have to ground them in the world that people come from. And this is one of the huge advantages of Second Life, because if you think about it, since it's stripped from reality, there's no taxes, there's no, there's very little in the way of legal systems. So there's no building codes, for example. And so, in fact, there's basically very few parameters related to real world, sort of physics. So you can, on one hand, have almost complete freedom to, express yourself in terms of the built world in any way you want. And yet what you find, not too surprisingly when you think about it, is that the way that people express themselves are in some ways pretty much the world they live in the real world, but also maybe the world that they would like to live in, or sort of their fantasy one-up version of their real life, stuff. And you see this, for example, in the Berlin video, if you've watched that already, and certainly the Pleasantville, which is a little more surreal. So when you're looking at all these, it's important to remember that virtual worlds don't exist in a vacuum. They don't exist as an other, in a sense of something being completely different. What they are is sort of modified versions or reinterpretations of the world that people are actually from. And this is one of the great advantages, because it's something that's digital and sort of 2/3 dimensional and can be recorded. If you're looking at this, you actually can get some significant insight into how people actually see their real world, just by virtue of how they're manifesting it when they have much more freedom. The fact that it's most of Second Life is actually very conservative in terms of what you actually see in terms of the landscape is sort of fascinating because that's not part of the reality of how it works. You see some absolutely fantastic, very, very surreal stuff in Second Life, and many of it's these temporary art installations that some are just absolutely amazing. But on the other hand, most people's way they function most of the time in Second Life is sort of stunningly mundane. And Pleasantville, when you watch that video, Pleasantville, though it's a little bit surreal and sort of the suburban ethos, really isn't that different than how a lot of people function when they're in Second Life. Because one of the things you have to remember about Second Life, which should be true of any virtual world, is it's not a game. There's no goal. There's no upscaling yourself or going to the next level or acquiring stuff or such like that you would if it's a game where you have this idea of somehow improving yourself. In Second Life, people just hang out. And that's one reason why a lot of people that try Second Life leave it, because they think it's digital, it's got to be a game platform, and therefore when nothing happens, there's no things to do. There's no, in the sense of, you have to save this princess, or you have to kill this dragon or whatever. There's none of the stuff that you get in a game. So there's no motivation to do X, Y, or Z unless you feel like it. And that, sort of unplugs a lot of people in terms of why they would be in Second Life. That's one of the critiques of Second Life. Some of the older versions like Sims and such like that had some parameters that were similar to Second Life, but in many cases they also had the idea of improving yourself as part of the goal of the game. That's one reason why there are more game platforms. So when you're looking at this logic, this is one reason why it's useful. If you go back and look at Miller's work, especially the really nice website that I strongly recommend, the Why We Post, that's done from University College London, where he works. That's a very complex study of social media cross-culturally that's been done. They're still doing it, I think now, 10 years later, maybe something like that. One of the huge things that's really important to understand that they found is that social media platforms, Facebook, Snapchat, all the rest of the stuff, don't actually shape the way we interact. From one culture to the other, people use these in ways that are culturally appropriate to them. So Facebook, and then a lot of their studies have noted that, for example, Facebook, even between places like Brazil and Chile, two countries that are next to each other, is radically different in terms of how people use that software platform and what they use it for and how they, their interaction, sort of exposure to it. And I think one of the problems you get, especially in the United States, is some sort of assumption that because we use Instagram or TikTok or something in a particular way, that's how it's used globally, when nothing could be further from the truth. Second Life is really interesting because on one hand, it's universal in the sense that everyone's on the same platform because they're actually interacting with each other. So it doesn't matter if you're Japanese or American or Brazilian or whatever, you're all in the same Second Life. So there's a universality that's sort of missing, say social media, which tends to be much more sort of constrained. On the other hand, it also means that if you've got someone who's Brazilian that wants to live in an American suburban bungalow, and someone who's Korean who's living in an American suburban bungalow, and someone who's from California living in the same bungalow in Second Life, you end up having to really think seriously about, well, those folks are coming from different cultural world experiences, so they must have different logics or reasons why they want that to be their residence. And that's certainly true. And that aspirational part, there's been basically no research done. It could be done. But one of the aspects of the virtual worlds, especially like Second Life, is because they were seen as entertainment, there's been a real anthropologists, geographers, social psychologists, everyone have been very leery to study this because it's not seen as real study because it's not, quote, in the real world, unquote. I mean, see, much of the same attitude till very, very recently about studying the social and emotional impacts of social media, because it was seen as one, a temporary fly-by-night phenomenon, and two, it was also seen as very much, well, the flavor of the week's going to be different next week. So there was sort of an assumption, very false, that it really wasn't worth the time to study versus studying a real family interacting in the real world in, say, Des Moines, Iowa, or something like that. And that's one of the huge problems that you have in doing this type of research, is that you really don't have a lot of colleagues and a lot of intellectual depth to the work that's been done today or the work that's actually going on. I've never quite understood why, especially as a geographer, but as far as I know, there's only about 4 or 5 geographers other than myself that even are interested in virtual worlds, especially say Second Life. More anthropologists are because they see the development of social groups and social networking and how quickly that occurs as being a real important model for the development of social and cultural grouping in the real world. So anthropologists have actually been more into virtual worlds, especially Second Life, than say the other social disciplines. But even then, it's not a mainstream area of study, which is sort of dumb when you think about it. But that's sort of the way it is. So what you get when you look at virtual worlds is that on one hand, there's a consistency and a commonality to them because they're based in people's referential world, which is their real life. On the other hand, they allow people, or in most cases, if they're going to be popular, they have to allow people the freedom to express themselves and interact and act and live in ways that are what some would be called escapist because they can't do them in the real world. And you see a lot of that, especially if you look at the Pleasantville episode. That's one of the reasons it's a fascinating documentary. So in that context, one of the problems you get into is if you're looking at conceptual patterns, is traditionally in the American concept, we really don't have the idea of discrete differences. Everything is seen as sort of like going up an escalator. You go gain or lose height, but you're not really changing. And so that's why if we segue ahead here, that's why in many ways, I think if you're going to look at virtual worlds, concepts, in this case, we use the ones from Asia since they're fairly common usage, are really handy because, as we'll see in the Asian context, they have a very, very different idea of place.